Thank you so much, Helen Sophie, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm really happy that a lot of you are here with us today. And thank you, Julian, for being my collaborator and partner for today. I will just like to begin with why we thought about doing this today and how it came about. So I have worked around sexual health for over 6 years here in Berlin, and before that I was working in the same field in Cairo in Egypt, where I'm from. Um, and I think for me, moving from a context like Egypt, Cairo, which is more conservative, um, moving to Berlin has been a very interesting experience because in many ways there's a lot of services, there's a lot of spaces. Um, but also with time I began to see the gaps and the issues that are existing, especially in the sexual health or the healthcare system. And of course, that was based on both my personal experience as a person of color, as a queer person, as a person living with HIV, trying to navigate the sexual health system in Berlin, which is a city that is known for, sex positivity and freedom, but also known especially for, in terms of issues of HIV and sexual health, to be quite progressive. But my personal experience was often contradicting with this fact. I often didn't make good experiences with doctors in the healthcare system, and the other part, apart from my own personal experience, is that I was working as a social worker in a sexual health center, and I saw that the system kind of works well for certain people, but for other people it was not working well. And when I say that, I'm talking about mostly if you have like a white cis bodies, then you have better access. Um, for a lot of people who, maybe to say it in a kind of blunt way, if you don't have a penis, then there is less access for you in the sexual health services. So a lot of cis women were having issues with access, and because they were not able to get tested in the sexual health centers, they have to go to gynecologists, where the waiting times are very long, and also a lot of people were not making good experiences. And this is actually one of the reasons why this connection with Pink Noise happened, because Banu's work is based on that, based on her experience as a woman of color, trying to navigate the sexual health system. And as you can see, we're sitting in this room that feels like we're inside a vagina or a womb. And that's part of the idea that her work and as an artist and as a sound artist connects with my work with sexual health and trying to think about sexual health in different ways. So in that sense, I saw a contradiction between Berlin's image as a sex positive space and that the sexual health system doesn't match the reputation of the city. But also, this is not the only aspect. Actually, when we think about sex positivity, it's a lot about also nightlife. It's a lot about the spaces like bars and clubs and sex clubs, which there are so many options of that in the city. And within the spaces also, I felt that there needs to be more conversation about how these spaces can play a positive role in sexual health. For example, providing condoms, providing harm reduction kits. Of course, there are projects doing that, but I think the institutions, there needs to be more conversations about that. So this is also when I thought it would be great to talk to Julian, because you are an organizer in nightlife, and also you have the experience in sex work and active sex work activism. So in those areas, I think there is also maybe like this idea of contradiction or gaps when it comes to like sex positivity. And when we talked in the very beginning, we said we want to ask the question, how sex positive is Berlin? And then we were said like, but what is sex positive, right? We're not sure what is sex positive. And I think when I think about it, and this is actually like open for us to discuss it, there is sex positivity as in freedom, but also having autonomy, having agency, having our sexual choices and our bodies respected, consent. All of these things are included. But we also notice that this concept is being more and more commodified to promote certain spaces as sex positive. And maybe, yeah, we will complicate this further, but I would like to invite you also to.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to this talk. Yeah, I also have had like personal experiences with sexual health that has not been very pleasant, and also being a sex worker who is part of sex worker rights communities here in Germany, but also globally. Like I'm was introduced, I'm the chair of Red Umbrella Sweden. And it might seem a bit strange that I live here, but I am active in this organization. But the situation in Sweden is quite complicated for people to be open. There's a lot of negative consequences that can happen for people who live there. And that's why, for me, it's important to be active, because I feel that I can be open in a way that a lot of my colleagues there cannot. And yes, I've also been part of organizing different events that focus on kink, sexual space, cruising, and so on. And I think, yeah, why we decided to do like an event during, for example, Folsom and Easter, which are these big fetish weekends here in Berlin that I'm sure a lot of people know about. But we noticed that there was no space that was mixed gendered, and we wanted to create space that was for anyone, no matter what gender you have, because we have a lot of these infrastructures of cruising and sexual space that has a quite long history, but it's very focused on like a cis male sexuality. And I think that that's also something that is very overwhelming in Berlin. Like, people say, yeah, there's a lot of space everywhere where you can have sex, but for who is that? And also, yeah, like there are issues in nightlife also about understanding of consent, and there's a lot of violations also happening in these sex positive spaces. So I think it's a very important topic to talk about. And I think it's also great if we can have like an open discussion also about sexual health experiences and experiences in these different spaces.
Yeah, so picking up on, again, the idea of sex positivity and the experiences in nightlife, but also elsewhere. This problem, we are now in June, the Pride Month, so there's a lot of conversation about the commercialization of our queer life, our identities. The fact that when you see a rainbow flag, that this means that this is a safe space, but how much does this correspond with the reality? And again, like this idea of safety or positivity, for whom that is conceptualized. Helen Sophie in the beginning read a little quote that from a text that I wrote, and I was in that text. It's called "Desire Trouble," and it was about how power dynamics play out in the dating situation, in the dating scene, and how people, how there was a discussion in Berlin from certain voices who were trying to deny that racism plays any role in sexuality or in dating or desire. And I think it was important for me to think about how power dynamics still play out in intimate relationships, and how some people are excluded, some people are included based on who they are. And these questions of power, if they play out in the most intimate interactions with other people, then they definitely still will play out in different contexts, like public spaces, or, I think especially spaces like cruising and sexuality are always in between public and private, because they can be a public space like a cruising space, and also can be private. And I think even like when we think about dark room, it is kind of like really the in-between between like public and private. Like, is it public or is it private? And this brings all these questions of like, how do we deal with these issues of power? And how do we deal with, how do we create the spaces? So I think I would like to ask you about that, like what things that you were thinking about when you are curating spaces to address these issues of power.
Yeah, a very interesting question. And also, I just wanted to say, because like first, when Madi asked me about this, I was like, I don't even know if I'm sex positive person. Like, what is being sex positive? Like, I use this like concept in my work sometimes, like you heard in the introduction. But for me, it's more like a process. It's something that I would like to reach, because I have a hard time seeing sex as something that is not problematic, and definitely relating to what you were saying about the issues of power imbalance. Well, there are more people here also who were part of organizing events with me, and maybe there will be some more input later if you want. For example, when we were organizing BOR, which is mixed gender cruising and fetish party, we basically looked around in like the different communities around us, and we were asking people, like, what would you need in a space that is sexual, where there is like a possibility for casual sex or going there with a partner and having sex within this party space. And we tried to just gather as much information as we could to kind of implement also as much as we could into the space. So we basically built a lot of things, or put stuff together that we got for free at Kleinanzeigen, etc., to try to accommodate like as much different approaches and needs in these spaces as possible. And then we also like invited people to join and like hire different people to host and to create also different corners that they wanted to create. So that was like our approach, basically, to create a space that was open for a lot of different needs.
Yeah, it's. I still want to circle back to sex positivity, and I think already before we began the conversation, we were sitting outside, and the conversation already began, because we were talking about sex positivity and living in a big city. Like, is this does this has to do with Berlin itself? Is it a Berlin thing, or is it something that happens in other spaces? Is it because it's a big city, or is it because there is this structure? I think one thing, of course, like if you look historically, like in Berlin after the wall fell, there was this already big movement of like raving culture that was picking up in the city, and a lot of people were moving to the city to do that. And the politics of the city was kind of ambivalent, because in one way they wanted to promote this image so that more people will move to the city, but at the same time we also have very conservative politics and politicians in the city. CDU, for example, who is the party that has for a long time opposed queer rights, but also is still leading the war on drugs on the city, which is one of the biggest contradictions in the city, again, as a city that has nightlife, sex positivity, liberation, but still has very conservative laws and around drug use, which is also reflected in a lot of the institutions and the club institutions, that there is this kind of hypocritical, I would say, approach to dealing with drugs, where you know that this place is existing because, or runs basically with help of drugs, but at the same time there is a very kind of strict policy, and this is shaped because of the politics of the city. And I think so from that time, from the 90s and until now, these things keep dragging on in the city. Like this, until now, there is a big discussion about how to go about legalizing drugs, and a big opposition also from the politics. And I think this also ties to the political stance on sex work. So there is knowing that there is, there is, as any place, like there is a market for desire or for pleasure, and there are migrants who are especially affected by this, but then the politics are also trying to, use it, but also, or capitalize on it, but at the same time restrict it.
No, definitely, and I think it's also a very current topic for me, because I was just today reading, I knew it was coming, but they were voting today in the European Parliament, basically about like a prostitution like guidelines for the EU. And what is interesting to see is that like they do these deliberate misinterpretations. Like, for example, they now have written in this document that the Swedish model, which is basically you criminalize the client and quote unquote decriminalize the sex worker, which is not actually true, because people in Sweden get deported and also evicted from their homes, get their children taken away from them, and live very isolated with a lot of stigma. But what they basically chose to turn was like to interpret this research that exists, that actually full decriminalization, which means that you take away all the criminalizing laws surrounding everything that has to do with sex work. And they said that this model that they then proclaim, the Swedish model, decreases, for example, transmission of HIV, when all research is clear that it's the decriminalization that decreases transmission of HIV. And they also have now chosen to word like, it's like goes against all the international definitions of trafficking. And they say that basically the breach of consent lies in the moment where somebody takes money for a sexual service, and not because you are being coerced, violated, forced, etc., which is the real, actually, definition of trafficking. And also, like for me, like sex worker rights is like you can't separate it from racial justice and migrant rights, because in Europe, for example, like 80% around this number is who engage in sex work are migrants.
So I think I would like to open up, but before, because we talked about like big topics and very political topics, I think I want to go back to the personal a little bit before we hear from you, whoever feels comfortable and willing to share opinions, thoughts, experiences. Um, but I want to go back to this idea again of commodification and that sex is more and more a commodity, and so if sex positivity is something that is used as a marketing or strategy, and also queerness, but also more and more intimacy. And this is one of the things that I struggle with in the city of, to try to find intimate connections, to try to build intimate connections with other people in terms of, sexuality and relationships in particular. And then there is always this question of like, do we have more choice? And is it because we have more choices that becomes confusing? Is choice, because we always think about choice as a good thing, but is it really choice if we value the idea of freedom so much, but not so much the value of justice? For example, if we have difficult situations in dating, maybe it's because there is a lot of freedom, but not so much emotional responsibility. Um, so these are the questions that I deal with as a queer person trying to navigate the city and also trying to navigate dating life.
No, I think that's super interesting, and I think also like, I don't know, I feel like also recently I've heard a lot of people saying that they came to Berlin to explore this freedom that is here and this sexual freedom. But then after some time, they realized that it wasn't really as liberating as they thought. And I think that has a lot to do with this promotion and kind of, commodification of sex and sex positivity that is being promoted outside. And I think, I don't know if other people can relate, but it's like you meet someone, you have the most amazing sex, and then it's like you never talk again. Why does that happen? And I would also be interested what people here think sex positivity is, because I think what you brought up about justice and like emotional responsibility towards each other, it's like it can be so disconnected that sex and emotions are so disconnected. And maybe because some people are scared also of this normative way of entering like relationships, or because of trauma, or because of other like power imbalances that exist. Yeah, I don't know if I think so much about sex positivity in relation to my work necessarily. I think more about like, is it going to be safe? Am I going to have access to like healthcare when I need it? Do I have like people in my life that know where I am when I'm working? But of course, like there is, for me, an openness to sex that has come also through this work. And sex work often gets very kind of scandalized, and it's this mystical thing or something, but it's not all about sex. It's also a lot about communication, and all the work that goes around, like before you meet someone to have a sexual interaction, for example, and also during meeting someone that you sell a sexual service to. It's also can be like, sometimes feel like it's care work or social work, or that you're a psychologist all of a sudden, or I don't know, like there is a lot of different like components that come into it. And for me, like I try to separate like my sexuality from sex work, which is not always so easy, and it's a struggle. But when I think about sex positivity for myself, like I think about it like, I guess in different parts, like the like consent being a very strong part of sex positivity, but also health and education, like educating myself, because I think that's also like a massive issue that, you know, like someone was saying, or you were saying before, like about this, that people don't always have the education around safer sex, but also doctors. People working in healthcare, they are not educated. A lot of them, they don't know what undetectable means. They don't know like what different medications people take that are actually coming to them. So I think, yeah, there's so many layers to what sex positivity can be. I was just also thinking about this because that's something that we actually talked about when we were doing these events that are very, very sexualized, and like we promoted it in very explicit kind of sexual ways. We also talked about the importance of people feeling comfortable not being sexual, because I often like to be in a very like sexualized space where people have sex around me, but I don't want to have sex there. I want to sit with my friend, talk about life, catch up or whatever, you know. And that's also like something that's important. I think that people often confuse sex positivity with being sexual, and yeah. Ah. Yeah, that it's like like, and that can also create a very strange pressure where it's like, oh my God, like I don't feel horny in this space. I don't feel there's something wrong with me. I'm not sex positive. Like, and then it's like, wait, is sex positivity about pushing people into doing things that they are uncomfortable with, or is it about everyone just being chill, like on the spectrum of non-sexual to sexual to, you know? And I think that's a very like important thing to emphasize when we create these spaces.
I think that logic of maximizing, like this male logic of maximizing pleasure or maximizing the availability of women, in that case, is interesting for me. That is similar to the capitalistic logic of maximizing. So there is this thing where you want to consume as many bodies as possible, and I want to go out and consume different bodies, and that being coupled with this idea of these things that you are also talking about, like not having eye contact, not having flirtation, not having this little moments of in between. I think there is for me this, and I mean, I also had very sexual phases of my life where I was very sexually active, and I had sex with a lot of partners. So definitely it is always important for me to kind of fight sex negativity, because I think we still live in a world that favors normativity, favors coupling. If you're not coupled, then maybe there's still something wrong with you. And a lot of studies will say you have a happier and healthier life if you have a couple or if you're part of the couple. And I think that even this science is biased, because there is something called singleism. Singleism is real, this bias against single people. So these things still exist, and there is a sort of negativity, and people who have a lot of sex, it's easy to label them as sex addicts. And I think even sex addiction is something that needs to be dissected a little bit, because what is the norm that we are measuring against? But at the same time, I think there is a capitalistic, patriarchal logic of maximizing availability. And when you combine that with certain spaces with drug use, then we see a lot of the problems of consent, of people getting emotionally or physically injured because of that. And this is, again, I think, ties to the idea of emotional responsibility again.
And yeah, like I agree with that, definitely. And I think also it makes me think, like, what is even the definition of sex? Like, a lot of people have also a very normative definition that sex is like one kind of physical action that you do with someone else, whereas for a lot of people, like, sex is, yeah, like anything from like flirtation to like sharing an emotion with someone, or sharing like a situation that can be sexual but not necessarily even about touching. So I think that that's also something that kind of constrains us into this like normative ways of seeing what sex is, and then we have these like gendered and also very like cis-centered expectations of like what sexuality should be and how we should interact sexually with each other. So I think that that's like, yeah, it's also interesting to kind of, I don't know, open up like sex, but not necessarily in the way where like we have to be more sexual in the way that we kind of are bombarded by different content or media or whatever, but open it up to something that is actually like a individual kind of experience, and that can be the opposite for people.